The morning air over Paris on August 25, 1944, carried a strange mixture of fear and hope as distant engines echoed closer to the city, a sound many had dreamed of and others had warned could mean destruction. Because after 4 years of occupation, no one knew whether freedom would arrive gently or whether Paris would pay for it with fire and ruin. To understand why the entry of American soldiers into Paris became one of the most powerful moments of World War II, it is necessary to return to the long silence that had settled over the city since June 1940, when German forces marched down the Champs-Élysées and Paris fell without a prolonged battle, leaving its people stunned by how quickly their world had changed. As cafes stayed open but freedom disappeared, radios spoke in controlled voices, and every public gesture became measured by fear. Because occupation did not arrive with constant explosions, but with rules, shortages, arrests, and the slow erosion of dignity. And over the next 4 years, Parisians lived under ration cards, curfews, and the ever-present reality that a wrong word or wrong look could mean prison or worse. While many tried to survive quietly, and others chose resistance, forming underground networks that printed illegal newspapers, gathered intelligence, sabotaged rail lines, and waited for the day when the war would finally return to their streets. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States, once distant from European battlefields, had been pulled fully into the conflict after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And by 1944, American industry, manpower, and planning had become central to the Allied effort to defeat Nazi Germany, with General Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, tasked with planning an invasion that would open a second front and push toward the heart of German power. That invasion came on June 6, 1944, when American, British, and Canadian forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in an operation that would become known as D-Day, a moment that marked the beginning of the end for German control of Western Europe. But victory did not follow quickly or easily, because the fighting inland was brutal and slow, with American soldiers advancing through hedgerows that turned fields into natural fortresses, where progress was measured in yards and paid for with lives. And while news of the landing spread through occupied France like electricity, hope inside Paris remained cautious because the city was far from the beaches, and many remembered how optimism in 1940 had ended in defeat. As weeks passed, Allied forces broke out of Normandy in late July, pushing German armies into retreat, and suddenly the question of Paris became unavoidable, not just as a military objective, but as a symbol. Because Paris was not an industrial hub like other targets, nor was it essential for supply routes in the immediate sense, and Eisenhower initially believed that bypassing the city was the logical choice, allowing Allied armies to maintain momentum toward Germany without being slowed by the need to feed, police, and protect a city of millions already weakened by years of scarcity. But war is never decided by logic alone, and the political, emotional, and moral weight of Paris pressed heavily on every discussion. Inside the city, resistance groups felt the ground shifting beneath their feet because German authority was weakening, but German weapons were still present, and many feared that if the Allies delayed too long, the Germans might crush the resistance or carry out scorched earth orders. And so, in mid-August 1944, Paris entered a dangerous phase as strikes spread among police, metro workers, and civil servants, bringing daily life closer to collapse, while also signaling open defiance, and resistance fighters began erecting barricades in streets, exchanging gunfire with German units, a move driven by desperation and hope, but also one that risked provoking harsh retaliation. Adolf Hitler, watching the Allied advance from afar, issued orders that left little room for compromise, declaring that Paris must not fall intact and that if withdrawal became inevitable, the city's bridges, monuments, and infrastructure were to be destroyed, turning one of the world's great cultural centers into ruins. And to carry out these orders, General Dietrich von Choltitz was appointed military governor of Paris in early August, inheriting both authority and responsibility at a moment when control was slipping. And although von Schultitz was a German officer bound by duty, he was also a witness to the reality on the ground, where supplies were low, morale was failing, and the prospect of holding the city against advancing Allied forces seemed impossible. As resistance fighting intensified, the sound of gunshots echoed through neighborhoods unaccustomed to open combat. Civilians were caught in crossfire, and rumors spread faster than facts, some saying the Allies were hours away, others warning of massacres. And in this atmosphere, Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces, pushed relentlessly for immediate action, arguing that Paris must be liberated by French troops to restore sovereignty and prevent the impression that France had been freed entirely by outsiders, a concern deeply tied to the future political order of post-war France. Under growing pressure, Eisenhower reassessed the situation, weighing military efficiency against humanitarian risk, because reports from Paris warned that food supplies were critically low, that civilians faced starvation, and that continued unrest could lead to widespread bloodshed. And by August 22, the decision was made to advance on Paris, marking a turning point not just for the city, but for the Allied campaign in Western Europe. The task of liberating Paris fell primarily to the French 2nd Armored Division under General Philippe Leclerc, a force that included veterans of earlier campaigns and carried enormous symbolic weight, supported by American units including the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, whose soldiers had fought their way from the Normandy beaches through weeks of intense combat. And for these American troops, Paris was not just a destination on a map, but a name loaded with meaning, representing culture, history, and the reason many believed the war in Europe mattered. On August 24, advance elements of Leclerc's division approached the city, encountering scattered resistance but no unified German defense, and that evening a small detachment entered Paris, a moment that spread like wildfire through the population, as word passed from building to building that Allied soldiers were inside the city, even as fighting continued in other areas. And through the night, resistance fighters and civilians waited anxiously, unsure whether morning would bring full liberation or a violent German response. When dawn broke on August 25, Paris awoke to sounds it had not heard freely in years. Church bells ringing across neighborhoods, voices shouting without fear, and the rumble of armored vehicles moving steadily inward. And as French and American troops advanced along major avenues and through narrow streets, crowds gathered despite the danger, waving flags hidden since 1940, embracing strangers and crying openly, because the moment they had imagined for so long was unfolding in real time. American soldiers entered Paris not as conquerors, but as allies, moving cautiously through intersections while civilians surged around them, offering flowers, wine, and handwritten notes, gestures that carried gratitude but also disbelief, as if touching a uniform could confirm that occupation was truly ending. And for many soldiers, the experience was overwhelming, because weeks earlier they had been fighting for survival in muddy fields, and now they were passing landmarks they had only known from books, realizing that history was unfolding with them inside it. Yet liberation was not complete because German forces still occupied key buildings, and sniper fire and sporadic fighting reminded everyone that danger remained. And at the center of this uncertainty stood General von Schultitz, whose decisions in the coming hours would determine whether Paris would be spared or destroyed. As Allied forces closed in on command centers and resistance leaders pushed for total surrender, knowing that every minute increased the risk of irreversible damage, American units worked alongside French forces to secure bridges, government buildings, and communication points, understanding that these structures were not just military objectives, but lifelines for a city on the brink. And as the day progressed, the balance tipped clearly against the German defenders, whose numbers were insufficient and whose situation was hopeless. Yet, until formal surrender occurred, the threat lingered, because explosives had been placed and orders had been issued, and no one could be certain whether they would be carried out. Civilians listened anxiously for news, resistance members waited for confirmation, and Allied commanders prepared for the final step that would decide the fate of Paris, as negotiations moved toward a moment that would either preserve the city or mark it forever. And as American soldiers continued to advance deeper into the capital, the future of Paris rested on a single choice still unmade, a choice that would soon reveal whether history would remember August 25, 1944, as the day a city was saved, or the day it narrowly escaped destruction. As August 25, 1944 moved toward its decisive hours, the center of gravity in Paris shifted to the Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli, where General Dietrich von Choltitz had established his headquarters, a location heavy with irony because it stood near the Louvre and the Tuileries, symbols of France's cultural inheritance that Hitler had ordered reduced to ashes if the city were lost. And inside those walls, von Choltitz faced the full weight of his situation, aware that German control was collapsing, that Allied forces were advancing from multiple directions, and that resistance fighters had already seized key buildings, while outside the city pulsed with expectation and fear, bells ringing, crowds gathering, and gunfire still echoing in pockets where German units resisted or waited for orders that might never come. Von Choltitz had received Hitler's instructions clearly, orders that demanded total destruction rather than surrender, but he also understood the reality that carrying them out would require time, coordination, and obedience from troops who were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly isolated. And although explosives had been prepared at bridges and strategic sites, the machinery of annihilation was incomplete, and the question was no longer whether Paris could be destroyed, but whether it would be, and by whom responsibility would be claimed. As French and American troops pushed closer to the center of the city, resistance leaders pressed their advantage, sending envoys to demand surrender and broadcasting messages that encouraged German soldiers to lay down their arms, while civilians filled the streets despite the risks, their presence itself acting as a form of pressure because every bridge crossed by cheering crowds was one less place where demolition could occur unnoticed. American soldiers of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division moved deliberately through neighborhoods, securing intersections and public buildings, coordinating with French units and resistance fighters who knew the city intimately. And this cooperation, imperfect and improvised, reflected the larger reality of liberation, where military planning met human urgency, and where decisions made under fire would shape the memory of an entire nation. By midday, it became clear that German resistance was fragmented, with some units surrendering without a fight and others retreating or barricading themselves in isolated positions. And as Allied commanders assessed the situation, they recognized that the collapse of German control was imminent, yet they also knew that the most dangerous moment often comes at the end, when a cornered enemy still holds the power to inflict irreversible harm. Inside the Hotel Meurice, von Choltitz met with French representatives, including members of the resistance and officers of Leclerc's division. And these encounters were charged with tension, because they represented not just a military exchange, but a moral confrontation, as the future of Paris hung on the choice of a single man. And while von Choltitz insisted on the formalities of surrender, the reality was that time was running out, and every delay increased the risk of chaos, accidental destruction, or a last act of obedience to orders that history would never forgive. Outside, the soundscape of Paris shifted from sporadic gunfire to celebration punctuated by caution, as civilians embraced soldiers, waved flags, and sang songs that had been suppressed for years. Yet many watched the sky and listened for explosions, knowing that liberation was not secure until it was official. And for American soldiers witnessing this moment, the contrast was striking, because they had trained for battle, not for parades, and the emotional weight of being welcomed as liberators in a city of such significance left a lasting impression, one that would be carried home long after the war ended. As afternoon turned to evening, the pressure on von Choltitz intensified, and faced with the collapse of his command, the impossibility of holding the city, and the growing certainty that destruction would serve no military purpose, he chose to disobey Hitler's final directive, a decision that would define his place in history. And although his motivations have been debated, whether driven by conscience, pragmatism, or a desire to avoid personal responsibility for cultural annihilation, the result was clear, because Paris would not be destroyed. Shortly after, von Choltitz signed the official act of surrender, transferring control of Paris to the Allied and Free French forces, a moment that passed quietly inside a room but echoed loudly across the city. Because with that signature, the occupation formally ended, and the threat hanging over bridges, monuments, and neighborhoods dissolved, replaced by a collective release of tension that had built for 4 long years. News of the surrender spread rapidly, and as it did, the atmosphere in Paris transformed, with crowds swelling, church bells ringing continuously, and spontaneous celebrations erupting in streets and squares, while Allied troops worked to maintain order, aware that joy could quickly turn dangerous if unchecked. And American soldiers, still on duty, balanced vigilance with wonder, standing guard as history unfolded around them. General Philippe Leclerc entered the city center to formalize the liberation, fulfilling a promise he had made years earlier that he would not rest until the French flag flew over Paris again. And when it did, raised above the city, it became a powerful symbol not only of military victory, but of national rebirth. While Charles de Gaulle arrived to assert the authority of the provisional French government.
Determined that France would emerge from occupation with its dignity and sovereignty intact, on August 26, a massive victory parade moved down the Champs-Élysées, with de Gaulle walking at its head, flanked by French and Allied forces, as crowds lined the avenue, cheering, crying, and sometimes falling silent as the weight of the moment settled in. And American soldiers watched from the sides or marched alongside their allies, aware that this was not their parade, yet knowing that their presence had made it possible, and that the bonds formed in this moment would shape relations between nations for decades to come. Even as celebration filled the city, the realities of war remained close, because snipers fired sporadically, reminders that not all German resistance had vanished, and Allied troops continued to clear remaining pockets, ensuring that liberation was secure and that civilians were protected. And in these quieter, less visible actions, American soldiers played a crucial role, providing stability during a transition that could easily have descended into chaos. For Parisians, the liberation brought immediate challenges alongside joy, because food shortages, damaged infrastructure, and political uncertainty did not disappear overnight, and the task of rebuilding a city and a nation lay ahead. But the psychological shift was profound, because the fear that had governed daily life was lifted, replaced by a sense of agency and hope that had been suppressed but not extinguished. For the United States, the entry into Paris represented more than a tactical success, because it reinforced the image of America as a force not just of military power, but of liberation, a narrative that would become central to its identity in the post-war world. And American soldiers who walked through Paris carried that experience with them, telling stories of crowds, flags, and gratitude that contrasted sharply with the hardship of combat and underscored why their sacrifices mattered. The liberation of Paris did not end the war, and many of the soldiers who celebrated in its streets would soon return to fighting as Allied forces pushed toward Germany, facing fierce resistance and heavy losses in the months ahead. But the moment of August 1944 stood apart because it offered a glimpse of what victory could look like: a city reclaimed, a people reunited with their freedom, and a future reopened. In the years that followed, the image of American and French soldiers entering Paris together would be replayed in photographs, films, and memory, sometimes simplified, sometimes romanticized, but always rooted in the reality that liberation was the result of choices made under immense pressure, including the decision to advance on the city, the courage of resistance fighters who rose at great risk, the restraint of a German commander who refused to carry out destructive orders, and the presence of Allied soldiers who crossed an ocean to fight in a war far from home. Paris survived not because destruction was impossible, but because at a critical moment, history turned on restraint as much as force. And as American soldiers moved on from the city toward the next objectives, they left behind a capital forever marked by the day freedom returned. A day when the sound of boots on cobblestones signaled not occupation, but the end of it. And when the world was reminded that even in the darkest chapters of war, decisions made by individuals can preserve what armies alone cannot replace.